A presentation by Every Farthing Publications. Word.
What's in a word? Perhaps more than you might first think. I ran into an interesting example of the importance of words in a book by a anthropologist who was studying the Native American groups in the Mojave area, the Hopis and the Navajos and so on. And I want to read just a little tiny section about his experience in interviewing a young girl who I think was probably around the age of 11 or so. He says, "It is easy to observe that questions which, when asked in English, were either not answered at all or else were answered in the negative, but when asked in Mojave, were answered quite readily and in the affirmative, usually pertaining to activities which are known to be condemned by whites, though they are not by the Mojave." So what's happening here is he's interviewing this young girl, a young Mojave girl. He's asking her about her sexual activities, and if the interview transpires in English, he gets one set of answers. If it's discussed in Mojave, in the Mojave tongue, he gets a quite different set of answers, including a lot of denial about things that he knows are true. So what's going on here? The first thing to understand, this has to do with the background. In the Mojave culture, it was expected and very much accepted that young girls and boys, starting roughly, I guess, around the ages of 9, 10, 11 or so, would become sexually active, and that was accepted. That was how life was, and it was okay. Whereas, of course, in the white world, this was not true at all, and particularly back when he was interviewing them, which was earlier in the 20th century. So he got one set of answers when he asked them in English, and another when the interview was conducted in the Mojave language. The important point that becomes clear in this example is that when a person enters into a language, when a person begins to speak in a particular language, in this case either the Mojave or the English language, he or she enters into a whole network of meanings. The network of meanings that is embodied in the language. For the child, when she was being interviewed in English, as she learned it in the white people's churches and schools, English was the language of shame. The Mojave language, on the other hand, which embodied the values and attitudes of her traditional culture, this was the language of permissiveness. The same act that caused her shame and motivated her to lie about her behavior when she spoke English caused her no shame, and she was able to talk about the same acts openly and freely if it was in the Mojave tongue. The language that we choose or that is forced upon us in large part determines the realities that we are talking about. It determines how we see them, how we experience them, how we think about them. The world that we live in general, but especially the social world that we live in, is created by language. When we speak about it, we are already embedded in a set of attitudes and values. Why is this important? Well, it's especially important for maps. If we are to resist oppression, we must resist the language that our society attempts to force upon us. Some of the key terms in this language are very familiar to all of us. They are words like perpetrator, pedophile, grooming, abuse, consent, assault, rape, victim, harm. These are the words that must be used in talking about any relationship between a map and a younger person, even relationships where there is no overt sexuality, because underneath it all there lurks that evil of some erotic feelings. Those are the words that must be used. For example, in treatment, the whole essence of treatment is simply to force a language system upon the people being, quote, treated. They are forced to speak about their experience in the correct language. That is, the language that embodies the beliefs and the attitudes and the values of the treatment leaders. And not only are there certain words that must be used, but there are certain words that must be avoided. We cannot talk about love or affection or being helpful or being supportive. The same thing happens in the media. If you watch how the media talks about things, the words that they choose, the language that they bring to bear on different events, and particularly events having to do with sexual abuse, that determines what images are going to emerge in the minds of the readers. And the words that are required construct a narrative. And if only one set of words is available, then that means only one narrative is available. So we have one story that fits all. All relationships between maps and younger people are the same. It's the same story. It's the only story that can be told. I had the interesting experience of observing the power of a single word when I was watching a documentary a while ago about Lewis Carroll. Everybody knows, of course, who Lewis Carroll is, the author of Alice in Wonderland, Through the Looking Glass, and so on. And rightly so, he's considered a very great writer, and perhaps one of the best writers of children's stories that ever lived. And pretty much everybody, I think, would have that assessment of his stories. But in the documentary, they were discussing, where he lived and where he went to school, where he was educated, his interest in mathematics, etc., etc. But then they came to the touchy issue of his relationship with the real Alice. There was a real Alice. She was probably, she was different ages. But at the time she was told the story of Alice in Wonderland, because he told it to her directly, she was probably, I don't know exactly, I would guess 9, 10, 11 years of age. Obviously, Lewis Carroll was in love with her. Now, the people that were being interviewed about Lewis Carroll and about his writings were quite disturbed by this. Underneath it all, there lurked that frightening question: is this guy that we have so much respect for really a pedophile? That word. Is he really a pedophile? And finally, one of the people being interviewed said yes, he was a pedophile. And a very interesting thing happened with another person who was struggling with this. She said, I hope he isn't, because I like what he writes so much. Now that's terribly interesting. If we apply this word to him, the word, the P word, the pedophile word, then how can his writing be any good? His writing must emerge from this cauldron of evil, and therefore it could not be a pure or worthwhile product. So when we ask, was Lewis Carroll a pedophile, what are we asking? We asking just, was he a scumball? Or are we trying to find out, was he in love with Alice? Well, if we're asking, was he in love with Alice, that's a no-brainer. Obviously he was. Anybody that knows anything about his story knows that's true. Was the love that he had for Alice at least in part sexual? Well, in terms of feelings, undoubtedly it was. He took pictures of her in the nude, many of which were destroyed. That was, by the way, more common in those days, but even so, he rather clearly enjoyed seeing her naked, thought she was beautiful. I doubt that he did anything explicitly sexual with her, but certainly erotic feelings would have pervaded the relationship and been mutual. I don't think there's any question about any of that. So does that mean that his writing isn't any good? I love those stories, she said. But must they be rejected? In essence, she was saying, must they be rejected because they emerged out of an unholy love? Was the love that Lewis Carroll felt for Alice an unholy love? Is the love that any map experiences for many of the minors that he has relationships with, either sexual or non-sexual, is that an unholy love in all cases? I suppose the answer to that question depends in large part on what sort of language we bring to the events when we're talking about them.